Part 1 again. We have dealt with Part 1. We're now on Part
briefly.
2. No. In fact, the member's time has expired. So,
Chairman.
Honourable David Cunliffe.
Chairman, firstly, may I record my agreement with the substantive points made by my learned colleague, Dr. David Clark, because it is a matter of procedural nicety that the earlier Part 2 was by SOP inserted into Part 1 of the bill, as it were, at the last moment, and thus the offending Henry VIII clause has been embedded in Part 1. Just for the benefit, sir, of the listeners.
Yeah, let me just reply to that. We've actually dealt with Part 1.
Yes, we have.
So let's just concentrate on Part 2. Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving to the substantive Part 2, which are a collection of transitional provisions relating to other parts of the Act. Mr. Speaker, unlike the offending Henry VIII clause, which delegates from the legislation a regulation-making power, which is thus not subject to the oversight and supervision of Parliament and thus the full measure of the democratic process, these clauses are, in fact, in some cases, perfectly sensible ways of handling the transition. And, sir, if I might draw the attention of the House to Clause 55 of Part 2, appearing on page 38 of the bill as reported back. This says that it replaces a fixed nominal interest rate, which is the late payment interest charged on an unpaid amount, which was in section 1392A and B, replace 0.843% of with, quote, the late payment interest rate multiplied by, close quote. And then in subsection 3, it makes clear that the late payment interest rate means the base interest rate plus 4%, calculated as an equivalent monthly rate expressed as a percentage and truncated to 3 decimal places, Mr. Chairman. And that's extremely useful for us to know, because what it does is provide a living mechanism whereby the legislation sets the rule, which is then automatically updated as the base interest rate, and thus the late payment interest rate, which is the base plus 4%, changes over time. Now, Mr. Chairman, that is an example of how to do a transitional provision without offending either the Regulations Review Committee or the estate of the late great Henry VIII, because it isn't delegating an opaque, broad regulation-making power. It is only delegating a very specific numerical formula which replaces a formerly static number, which of course became less and less meaningful over time because of the time value of money and inflation. So, sir, it's a matter of some interest that the Minister and the Chair has provided over one piece of legislation which in one place does offend the best principles of parliamentary scrutiny, as you say, sir, quite rightly, now vested by amendment in Part 1 of the bill, and here in Part 2 of the bill has other clauses which do not so offend standing orders, the Regulations Review principles, or the best practices of parliamentary democracy in the Westminster system, and would leave McGee, for example, perfectly comfortable with the mechanism being followed. The question, sir, is why the Minister has a bob each way in 2 different parts of this bill. If it was good enough to do it properly in Part 2, why did the Minister feel the need by amendment to insert an offending clause in the middle of Part 1? Mr. Chairman. And, Mr. Chairman, I guess that brings the House back to matters which were the subject of debate before your colleague departed, sir, which was that this bill is a tinkering bill which, while on the face of it, in general, the Labour opposition supports because it does act towards the principle of fairness in a very small way. But it is mainly, sir, a bill of missed opportunities. We are tinkering with a student loan scheme that is bedevilled by 2 fundamental flaws. One is it's building up a mountain of billions of dollars of debt, much of which will not be repaid because the students' concerns have become exiles overseas in what is the second highest diaspora after Ireland of any country in the developed world. Mr. Chairman, and the second problem is that it is perpetuating by its inaction an intergenerational unfairness or inequity, which has seen people of the minister's generation benefit from a free subsidised state education all the way to postgraduate level without having to take out huge student loans, got paid a bursary just like I did. Mr Chairman.
Honourable David Cutler.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. And today's students, if they have the courage to take on the debt to get their way through tertiary education, they finish with a mortgage and no house. A mortgage and no house. And we all know, sir, that New Zealand's earning rates for graduates, vis-a-vis, say, Australia, are around 1/3 lower. They were 30% lower when the current government came into office, sir, but the current government promised New Zealanders it would close the gap with Australia, and so, of course, inevitably it got wider. And they're now, my last understanding is about 37% different on a GDP per capita purchasing power parity basis. Mr Chairman. Well, in other words, in common English, it's getting worse, the gap's getting wider, and the implication, sir, is that more and more of our graduate students are leaving in order to be able to repay the student loans that are the millstone around their neck. And that is a perverse consequence that this House is going to have to spend a whole lot more time on in the term of the next government, working together, because the Minister in the chair is not prepared to do step change. He only does small change, and all the House has today is small change. Mr Chairman, let me draw the attention of the House to Clause 53, Section 119. It replaces the former meaning of excess repayment, and it contains a number of sub-clauses, 1A, B, C, 2A through D, down to line 25, sir, which cover in some detail the penalties and obligations apportioned to excess repayment. Sir, there is a certain irony in this clause. How many of today's recent graduates or current students are capable of so-called excess repayment? Excess repayment would be a fine thing when they can barely feed themselves or pay for the rent while they get their first jobs straight out of university with a millstone of a huge debt around their neck. And it is because of their inability to repay, because of forces beyond their control, like the fact that we are 270,000 jobs short in this country and we have a government that is doing precisely nothing to fix it. Those are factors beyond their control, sir, which means there won't be much excess repayment under this clause in Part 2. Mr Chairman, 56A, Section 145 is amended. It's the application of different types of relief for borrowers. Well, that sounds interesting. Perhaps it's a neck and shoulder massage. But no, we see in 146 the Commissioner may grant relief from late payment interest. And, sir, that is, in our view, a very sensible provision to include in this bill, sir, because it gives the Commissioner discretion to look at individual life situations on a case-by-case basis. Why is discretion important in the law? Because no two lives are the same, and it would take volumes to try to write prescriptively all the criterion that a sensible and worthy Commissioner should take into account if trying to decide every case off some fantasy rulebook. Better to have a well-trained Commissioner subject to proper principles and oversight and to delegate appropriate discretion. Sir, the same does not apply to Henry VIII clauses, as has been vested by the Minister by amendment in Part 1. So, Mr Chairman, summing up, all in all, the transitional provisions currently contained in Part 2 of this bill are somewhat underwhelming. They are, for the most part, sensible. They do not, for the most part, in fact, I don't think at all, offend the principles of standing orders, such as that now vested in Part 1, which delegates a regulation-making power because the government couldn't think its way properly through legislating. That's the problem. The problem, sir, is, as with the rest of this bill, worthy though most of it is a bill of small changes, while what we need is a step change. It does not address the yawning chasm of billions of dollars of student debt. by more than $7.5 million over 5 years. Barely enough, it might be said, to cover the cost of the House's time and the implementing officer's time and the compliance costs associated with the measure. Certainly doesn't solve a billion-dollar problem. And secondly, sir, that it does nothing to resolve the intergenerational equity issues which have bedevilled today's students.
I call Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll begin in part two where the previous speaker left off.